Hey, today we are going to create this beautiful hyacinth painting together. We're going to start by drawing it, then work with watercolor, and by the end of this video, you will have made one of these yourself. Let's have a look at this gorgeous hyacinth that we're going to paint. The flowers are arranged around the stem all the way around 360 degrees, and the flowers each have 6 petals. The leaves have these gorgeous stripes. They're a little curved and they have, it seems almost like white stripes going through. So with that in mind, let's start mixing our colors. This color is called wisteria, and it is a shortcut if you have a light purple like this, because then you don't have to mix. Otherwise, you can just use a red or pink and a blue and try to mix it yourself. I'm taking ultramarine blue and mixing it into the wisteria color because I am trying to get to a different shade of purple. In order to make the painting more interesting, I really like having multiple similar colors. So that's what you see that I've mixed here. And now we are going to look at this stem and the flower and start sketching. Make sure when you're sketching with your pencil that you do so lightly, because it's really difficult or damaging to do a lot of erasing on watercolor paper. So go as slow as you need to and start with the stem a little to the left of the center because of that curve of the flower. So then we are going to start with our very first flower. Remember, there are 6 petals coming out from a central tube. And I know that this may look a little slow or time intensive, or maybe you just don't love the sketching stage. But hear me out. The best, and I'm not exaggerating, the best advice I ever received when I was beginning as an artist was that if I want to learn to paint, you first have to learn how to draw. And it was a tough pill to swallow. I was not happy when I got that advice. But it was really good advice that has helped me with my painting and to create beautiful artwork. So I'm speeding the process up a tiny bit so that you can still follow every single step. Feel free to pause if you need to at any time to follow along. And I will also give you a reference image that you can pause on if you prefer to do your own drawing from that photo. As we sketch, remember that the flowers exist 360 degrees around the stem. You're probably not going to see a lot of the ones in the back, but you're able to create beautiful layers of the flowers and have them pointing in all sorts of different directions, just like they are on the real flower for visual interest. Give each of the petals a nice little curve to give it that really organic feel. None of the flowers, none of the petals look exactly the same. Notice also, while you look at this flower, that not every single petal is going to be shown in full. Some are just going to be peeking out from the back, depending on the angle. Let me get in a little closer so you can see exactly what I mean. So here we are going to add some petals in the back. You can see the flower is partially covered. And you can see here again how the flower looks from the side. The angle changes, the petals look different. Here we have one that is more open to be viewed from the front, another partial one from an angle in the back, and we finish with a single one on top as a little point. I really like filling out a bunch of the flowers so that there are layers, but you can skip that part if it is too much for you at this time and you want more simplicity. Now let us add in a few leaves. We're just going to add 2. This is going to be slightly turned to the side and it crosses in the back. And we'll add another one on the other side. Try to follow without putting your pencil down the line of where it would end up so that it makes sense in the background and looks like it is connecting behind the flower. So now let's get to the fun part. Let's start painting. What we are going to do here is add a very light wash, a very light color, and we're going to add it only on the tips of the petals. To get this light wash, I mixed before, here you see in the corner, a ton of water with just a tiny bit of the pigment. But I'm not actually picking up that much of it with my brush because I want to be able to control it well. I repeat the process for each of the flowers. I continue to outline the tops and the curves of each of the leaves. Sorry, the petals, the flower leaves. It's such a beautiful way to start. I love adding this tiny bit of color and really seeing how the painting grows layer by layer. It's so calming and meditative, and I really hope that it brings you into that flow state as well. So keep going. It is a tiny bit of a repetitive process, but it is so worth it to create the beauty in the end. Almost done. When we're done with this first stage, we are going to let it dry, but we're able to continue painting. So we are actually going to apply the same kind of color to the base of the flower, to the base of that cup shape. Again, use your very light wash, use just a little bit of it, and trace around the bottom, adding a little more color at the very bottom in a C shape and a little bit around the sides. And repeat for every single base of every flower petal. Add a little bit of extra water to your brush and go back to that very pale wash. And now we are going to repeat that process, but with a slightly different twist. We're going to take this even lighter color and we're going to do a wash of the full flower. So we want to make sure that there is some color, very, very light wash on every part of the flower, or at least almost every part. You can leave a few white little spaces for interest if you like. But we're doing this including over top of what we had already painted. So some areas of the flower are going to have only this light wash, and some of them are going to have the slightly darker wash from a minute ago, plus this on top of it. Make sure that your flower is dry when you start this. If you didn't wait, it's not the end of the world. You'll just have a little less definition. The flowers, the colors of the flowers are going to flow together a little more, but it's okay at this beginning stage if that happened. There's different techniques in watercolor, wet on dry and wet on wet. And for almost all stages of this painting, we're going to be using wet on dry. So let's let it dry again. Okay. Once it is dry, come on back and join me. We are going to take a slightly more saturated color, still relatively light, but more saturated than the two we've just used. And we're going to use it to add a tiny bit of shading and definition. Again, following some of the curves of each of the flowers and petals from the bottom, from the base, upwards. By the way, if you accidentally have too much water on the page, it can happen, just take a tiny bit of paper like this and lightly dab it off. And then continue with each of the little petals. Now, you may be wondering, why are we doing this? And why is it taking so long? Is this really necessary to add these soft washes with barely any color? But I promise you, with this technique, it's all about layering, and it is going to give you this incredibly delicate, gorgeous, intricate result that is just so interesting when you see the different layers peek through. So please stick with it, give it a chance. It's going to turn out stunning. But let's move on now to a color that has a little more oomph. So in my case, I'm using a pink because I like having a little variation, you know, not having purple, 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 but adding, hey, let's add a little bit of blue and pink in here to, again, give it a much more natural feel and have something that's really interesting to look at. So I'm using the tiniest brush I have. I love this. It's my favorite brush ever. And I am going over the very bottom. And in addition, I am going over basically tracing, not one by one, but tracing slightly parallel to the curves of the petals. And it is such a gorgeous look that is going to shine through the next layers. It's my favorite part, basically, of the entire painting. I am now mixing some of the ultramarine blue. I'm trying to create a color that is a little darker, a little more saturated, and different again from what I've used before. And with that, we are going to start thinking of areas where there would be shadows. So that's what I'm applying here in my drawing. I am thinking, okay, there would be shadows at the very base of the flowers, of each of the flowers. There would be a little shadow right where the petals curve. So, you know, they kind of curve over the top and back down, and right underneath that, there would be some shadows. And there would also be some shadows where a flower is covering another one in the background. So if there is a little petal that's partially covered, then probably right at the edge where they overlap, there would be some shadow or some shade. And that is what I'm adding here. You want to replicate that for your own process. Okay, we have to let it dry again, but we're not going to wait around. We're going to move on and paint some of the stem in the meantime. So I'm going to take my two greens and I am mixing a color that I think will look nice. This is not scientific botanical illustration, so it does not have to be perfect. Pick something that you think looks beautiful. And you'll see here, I don't even clean my palette because I think it always adds a little bit of extra interest to have a really unique color creation. So with that green, a lighter green, I'm going to start painting the stem. I don't paint it fully. I let tiny little white areas in between. So I'm painting those lines. Remember, the green is a little striped. And so I am trying to recreate that. Now, when you paint this, make sure that the areas that you're painting next to have dried fully so that you don't inadvertently end up with a kind of mess of the green and the purple. And then repeat the process. Again, adding a little more saturation with every layer as you go, and adding these gorgeous striped features. Repeat the same layering process that you've learned at the beginning of this video. Keep adding more saturation of the green. I think a good place to add that is right where you see the stem and a petal covering it, because you want maximum contrast for that petal to pop. So either you want it against kind of, as light as you can, almost a white green, really, really light, or you're going to add tons of paint and really, really darken up the area that is surrounding those petals. So I went with the latter approach, and so you see me here adding lots of saturated, vibrant green. I'm going to keep going over it right around the petals. That is one of the most interesting, important parts that you want to pop. In fact, I think now looking back at it, I would have added even more at the end to really make the flowers stand out. But here you see, I'm adding just a little more as I go, and with any paint that I have on my brush, I always try to hit a few different areas. So you see I painted a bit at the bottom of this leaf, now I painted the very top, now I'm doing a tiny section in the middle and the side here. So I like the colors kind of spread out and picking up on each other. Now I'm going to apply the same shade to the other leaf quite quickly and generously. It gives it some lightness that is a little bit in contrast to the very slow, intricate way that I've been painting the petals. So now let us let that dry and pop back over to the petals. Now you see I'm back with a tiny, tiny, tiny favorite brush, and I have really saturated paint. So this is like a deep purple, and I have very little paint on the brush, but I am basically thinking, hey, if I ended up lightly erasing the pencil marks later, where are there areas that would just kind of disappear because they don't have a lot of definition right now? And those are the areas, those pencil lines, that I am now basically tracing with this super, super dense color in the most fine line possible that I possibly can. Sometimes I let it flare out a little like you just saw there. I think that again adds some real beauty and makes it look a little more intentional and interesting than just an outline. You may also want to add it like I am doing here in some of the center parts where there would be a little bit more darkness, a little bit more shadow. By the way, I have a huge favor to ask of you, and that is that I would love to hear your honest feedback. So I just recently started doing these watercolor tutorials. I've been painting with watercolor myself for the last 4 years and have recently started creating products with my artwork, selling my artwork, and so forth. But I want to share what I have learned, and I really want to hear from you. Is this format helpful? Are you enjoying it? So yeah, is it too detailed? Is it too fast? Are you able to follow along step by step? Is this working, basically? I want to know honestly. So please, 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 please tag me in your result, and please leave me a comment here on YouTube. Either or is fine too. I'm just so curious, and I want to see, tell me, how long have you been painting with watercolor? And just tell me everything, please. I want to make this a series that you love. So I need to hear about your experience with it. Thank you so much. Anyway, I'm sorry, we kind of skipped over some of the things there. So let me tell you recently here what I did and what I am doing in this very moment. You may want to rewind or watch it in a slower fashion, but I promise you everything that I just did while I ask you for your honest feedback is exactly what I described in the step before. So I'm going over some of those, edges, creating a really intricate, detailed, fine line to add a bit of contrast. I am adding a bit of oomph, adding some shadows, and just really applying some of that darker paint where it would naturally occur, where there would be shade or shadow, or even just to add some of that kind of 3D effect of, well, the flower goes out here or the petal goes in there. So if you have done that, let's move on to finishing up the leaves. So I'm adding, again, a more saturated layer here. You can see I'm actually sometimes using the brush in this case a little differently. So using it on its side, and that is how I got that, thicker green mark at the bottom. It also worked out because I was using the wet on wet technique there. So that kind of creates some of that, like a bloom. It kind of, the paint moves on its own, and it's a really fun thing to do if you have a little more space, like I do in that leaf, right? In the little petals, I wouldn't have the space to do that and be able to control it, but here I can do it. And then you saw me here take the last little paint. So use a different shade of green that you haven't used yet and fill in some of the areas that are a little lighter. Again, you're just creating some visual interest, adding a bit of diversity of color for your eye to look at here. So that's my style. I hope you love it. I hope you let me know if you try. But that's what I'm doing here, and I hope you are following along. I'm repeating the process with the other pure green. So these are both not colors that I had mixed before. I had used them to mix a color, but now I'm taking them straight out of the pan and just adding a little more. I'm especially doing what I told you is really important before. So now that the leaves had dried, I'm adding the darkest green that I have selected for this painting right around those petals, because I want the petals to pop, to be very, visually different and just like come off the page. And so for that, I need to make sure that they're not blending into the leaves. So I'm making the leaves darker right behind the petals. This is my absolute favorite stage of painting with watercolor, because there's this known saying that the watercolor is going through an ugly stage. So when you paint with watercolor, sometimes while you're working with these layers, you're thinking, oh my goodness, this is not looking pretty at all, and you want to give up. By the way, here, taking a little more of that really saturated green and adding super fine lines that go the length of the leaves. Remember, we saw those at the very beginning, and it's adding another layer of beautiful detail. And here I'm taking the most saturated color I have for the purple. I add a little more blue, and I'm adding it right in the centers of the flower for the ones that are facing forward or where you can see the center, or well, I guess that's really where I'm adding it, but I'm not adding it for every single one. So just consider which direction the flower is pointing in and whether you would actually be able to see the center. But this is, again, adding that little bit more of dimension that is so stunning. So yeah, I was saying, I'm glad we're out of the ugly stage. I always think it's those last final details and those last final layers that take it from ooh to wow, this is nice. So I'm glad that you stuck with it with me. I'm doing this extra little step, totally unnecessary, but totally fun, which is I basically add the color palette that I used here, and I just think it looks neat. There's zero purpose to it whatsoever, but I hope you like it, and I hope you love the end result. Let me know. I want to hear from you.